The ship had no name in any alien language. No translation matrix in the known galaxy could render it properly. The closest the Vilhari could manage, the oldest spacefaring civilization in the Orion Arm, a people who had mapped stars before humanity had learned to plant crops, was a guttural sound that meant roughly, the thing that should not move as fast as it does. But the humans called her the ISV Promethean Rage. And on the morning everything changed, she was sitting perfectly still at the edge of the Keth Nebula, running dark, no emissions, no active sensors, no transponder signal. To every telescope and scanner array in the Tarkhan hegemony's border fleet, that region of space was empty. It was not empty. Inside the Promethean Rage, 612 human beings were very, very quiet. Not the quiet of fear. Not the quiet of people waiting to be saved. The quiet of people who had already decided what they were going to do. People who had done the math, checked the numbers twice, said their private words to whatever they believed in, and were now simply waiting for the clock to reach zero. Captain Sarah Voss stood at the center of the combat bridge, both hands resting flat on the tactical rail, eyes fixed on the holo display floating in front of her. Her face was unreadable. Her knuckles were white. On the display, a single gold dot pulsed steadily. The Tarkhan processing station, Hegemony Outpost Keth 7, hung in orbit around a dead moon 340,000 kilometers away. 17 levels. Approximately 4,000 Tarkhan administrative personnel, soldiers, and contracted workers. And somewhere inside it, in a detention block the Hegemony hadn't officially acknowledged existed, 11 members of the Promethean Rage's crew were being held without charge, without trial, and without the basic protections guaranteed under the Galactic Compact that the Tarkhan Hegemony had signed 40 years ago with their own blood ink. 11 people. Chief Engineer Dara Okafor, Navigation Officer Tomas Reyes, 7 others from the Forward Survey Team, and 2 people who made Sarah Voss's jaw clench every time she thought about them. Ensign Priya Mehta, age 22, first deep space posting, and her husband, Corpsman Alexei Mehta, age 24, married 11 months ago. Sarah had given the toast at their wedding. The Tarkhan had seized them 6 days ago, called it a border incursion, said the survey team had crossed into restricted space, a claim that ISV navigation logs disproved down to the meter. The Hegemony's response to those logs had been to stop answering communications entirely. Earth Command had filed a formal diplomatic protest. The Hegemony had not responded. Earth Command had escalated to the Galactic Compact Oversight Council. The council had opened a review. Estimated resolution 4 to 7 standard months. Standard. Sarah Voss had read that estimate, set it down on her desk, and gone to find Admiral Cho. She had made one request. 48 hours of operational independence. No orders, no oversight. Whatever happened in that window was between her, her crew, and whatever version of God had enough nerve to show up. The Admiral had looked at her for a long time. Then he had looked away, out the viewport, at the stars. "I don't know where you are, Captain," he had said quietly. "And I won't know for the next 48 hours. Comm relay in this sector is unreliable." Sarah had nodded once. "Understood, sir." That had been 31 hours ago. Now she checked the chrono on her wrist, looked up at her crew. Every face on that bridge, young faces, experienced faces, faces tight with controlled fury, turned toward her. She didn't give a speech. Sarah Voss was not a speech kind of woman. She said 4 words. "Bring them home now." And the ISV Promethean Rage lit up like a second sun. Every engine firing simultaneously. Every system powering from cold silence to full combat readiness in 4.3 seconds. A transition that, according to Tarkhan military doctrine, was physically impossible for a vessel of that class. Tarkhan doctrine was about to be updated. At Outpost Keth 7, a junior sensor officer named Drivak was halfway through a routine scan when every alarm on his board triggered at once. He stared at his readout, looked at it again, tapped the screen to make sure it wasn't frozen. It wasn't frozen. He hit the intercom with a shaking hand. "Command, there is a human warship. It appeared." It is already inside our defense perimeter. It is. He checked the closing speed. Checked it again. His next words came out very small. It is not slowing down. The Tarkhan hegemony had been at war 3 times in the last 2 centuries. They were not a peaceful people by nature. Few species that reached the stars were. But they were a proud people. And pride had a way of making even experienced soldiers underestimate things they had never personally faced. The garrison commander of Outpost Keth 7, a heavy-set Tarkhan officer named Veth Durak, had read the intelligence files on human warships. He had attended the mandatory briefings after the Valgon incident, the incident no one in the hegemony liked to discuss, and he had filed the information away in the same mental drawer where he kept earthquake protocols and reactor meltdown procedures. Useful to know. Unlikely to ever matter. He was revising that assessment at high speed. The Promethean rage dropped sublight at a distance that Tarkhan naval doctrine classified as insane. Not aggressive, not bold. Clinically, medically, certifiably insane. She came out of her burn 200 kilometers off the station's primary docking face, so close that Keth 7's point defense systems triggered automatically and had to be manually overridden to prevent them from opening fire. She was enormous. That was the first thing Durak registered as the visual feed came up on his command deck. He had seen the schematics. The schematics had failed to prepare him. The Promethean rage was 2.4 kilometers long and built like someone had taken the concept of a battering ram and scaled it up to planetary assault levels. She had no elegant curves, no aesthetic flourishes, none of the sweeping lines that characterized Tarkhan or Velhari capital ships. She was dense, brutal, and functional in the way that avalanches are functional, doing exactly what physics intended with maximum commitment. Her hull was scorched in places, old battle damage, partially repaired. This was not a ship kept behind glass. This was a ship that had been places and done things and was completely unbothered by what you thought about that, and she was pointing directly at the station. Every weapon port on her forward face was open. Durak counted them, stopped counting at 40, swallowed once. His communications officer looked at him. "They're hailing us, Commander." "Put it through." The voice that came over the channel was calm, dangerously calm, the kind of calm that isn't the absence of emotion, but the very careful containment of a tremendous amount of it. "Outpost Keth 7, this is Captain Sarah Voss of the ISV Promethean Rage United Earth Navy. I'm going to keep this simple, because I think simple is better for everyone right now." Durak opened his mouth. Sarah kept talking. "You are holding 11 members of my crew in Detention Block 7. Sub-Level 4. You have held them for 6 days without charge, without legal counsel, and without notification to their families. This is a violation of Articles 7, 12, and 31 of the Galactic Compact, which your government signed and which I have loaded into my targeting computer as a reference document." A beat of silence. "You have 20 minutes to release all 11 personnel to the shuttle bay. They will come aboard unharmed, and I do mean unharmed, because my medical team will be running full scans the moment they're on deck, and I will know if anyone on your station has touched them. When my people are safe, I will withdraw. This station will remain intact. Your personnel will remain alive. Everyone goes home." Another pause. When she spoke again, something had shifted in her voice. Something that made the temperature on Durak's command deck feel like it had dropped several degrees. "But if those 11 people are not in that shuttle bay in 20 minutes, if 1 minute passes beyond that deadline, I want you to look out your forward viewport, Commander. Look at my ship. Really look at her. And I want you to understand something. She is not my most powerful vessel. She is not even in my top 5. She is the ship I sent because I was trying to be reasonable." The channel stayed open. Durak could hear faintly the background sounds of a combat bridge at full readiness, the low hum of charged systems, the quiet professional voices of crew running through checklists. People who had done this before, people who were not angry, people who were beyond angry in that cold, clear territory on the other side of it. His second-in-command leaned close. "Commander, what are your orders?" Veth Durak looked at the Promethean rage on his screen. He looked at his 23 defensive cannons. He did some math. "Get me the detention block supervisor," he said quietly. "Tell them to start processing releases." It should have ended there. In a rational galaxy, it would have ended there. 11 people released, 1 warship withdrawn, a diplomatic incident filed away and quietly forgotten. The hegemony saves face by framing it as a voluntary release. Earth gets its crew back. Nobody dies. But Veth Durak was not the only person on Outpost Keth 7 with authority, and the man who outranked him had just arrived on the command deck. High Executor Marin Solv was not a military man. He was a political appointee, a career bureaucrat with the hegemony's interior ministry who had been stationed at Keth 7 for 8 months to oversee the processing operations that the hegemony officially didn't talk about. He was 61 years old, had never served in the military, had never been in a combat situation in his life, and had spent 4 decades watching governments back down from positions the moment real pressure was applied. He had concluded from this that pressure was almost always a bluff. He looked at the Promethean rage on the screen. He looked at Durak's order to begin processing releases. "Cancel that order," he said. Durak turned slowly. "Executor, that ship is 1 vessel." Solv straightened his collar. "We have a defense fleet 17 minutes away. Hegemony battle doctrine clearly states that a lone vessel, regardless of class, cannot successfully engage a defended station and an incoming fleet simultaneously. They are bluffing, Commander. They want to provoke an incident that justifies Earth expanding into this sector. If we release those prisoners, we validate their aggression and invite further incursions." Durak stared at him. "Sir, with respect, I have read the intelligence files on—" "I have also read them." Solv clasped his hands behind his back. "I found them sensationalist. Open a channel to that ship. Tell them their deadline is rejected. Tell them hegemony reinforcements are en route, and they should withdraw immediately or be considered a hostile combatant." Durak was quiet for 3 full seconds. "Sir," he said very carefully, "I need you to understand what I am about to tell you. Not as a formality. I need you to actually hear it." "I'm listening." "The intelligence files you found sensationalist were written by Admiral Preth Vaughn. Admiral Vaughn personally observed human naval engagements at the Valgon incident, at the siege of Corridor 9, and at the 3rd Kethera engagement. He described the Valgon incident as—" Durak paused. "He described it as the single most psychologically destabilizing military event of his career. He retired 6 months later. He has not spoken publicly about it since." Solv blinked. "Your point?" "My point, Executor, is that Admiral Vaughn spent 40 years in the hegemony Navy. He had seen everything." Durak looked back at the screen, at the Promethean rage, sitting there, patient, waiting. Everything except that. There was a pause. Solv sent the message anyway. On the bridge of the Promethean rage, Sarah Voss read the hegemony's response without changing expression. Around her, she felt her crew go very still. Navigator Chen, who had 3 younger siblings and called his mother every week without fail, set down his stylus with a small, precise click. Weapons Officer Bashir, who had been on this ship for 9 years and had never once raised his voice on duty, exhaled very slowly through his nose. Chief of Security Torres, who had personally trained 6 of the 11 people currently in Keth 7's detention block, put both hands on his console and looked at the floor for a moment. Sarah let the silence sit for exactly 5 seconds. Then she turned to Torres. "What's the detention block structure?" 4 levels below the main operations ring. Internal bulkheads are standard Tarkon administrative grade, not military reinforced. There are 2 guard rotations. Based on the patrol patterns we pulled from the station's external sensor bleed, current rotation change is in approximately 9 minutes. Structural weak points? Junction corridor on sub-level 3 connects directly to the emergency shuttle access. If we put a boarding team in through the secondary docking port, the one on their maintenance ring, which their defensive grid has a 17-degree coverage gap on, we have a path that avoids their main security checkpoints entirely. Sarah nodded slowly, looked at the station, looked at the countdown she'd given them, now showing 12 minutes remaining, still ticking on her secondary display. She hadn't stopped it. She had kept it running because part of her, the part that had given the toast at Priya and Alexei's wedding, the part that remembered Dara Okafor teaching her daughter to ride a bicycle on the station promenade, the part that had read Tom Reyes's last letter home because he'd asked her to keep a copy in case anything happened. That part was still hoping someone on that station would look at the clock and make a smarter choice. "Commander Yates," she said. Her Marine commander stepped forward. "Captain, take fire teams 1 through 4. Boarding configuration. Non-lethal primary. Lethal authorized in defense of rescued personnel." A pause. "Bring them home." Yates met her eyes, nodded once. "Yes, ma'am." As the Marine teams moved toward the assault bay, Sarah opened a channel to Keth 7 one more time. Her voice, when she spoke, was almost gentle. The way a doctor's voice is gentle when delivering a diagnosis that cannot be changed. "Executor Solve, I know you're listening. I want you to know that what happens in the next 30 minutes is not what I wanted. I gave you every chance to make a different choice." She closed the channel. "Helm, close to engagement range. Weapons, active. Begin jamming their fleet relay beacon. I don't want reinforcements complicating my Marines' work." The Promethean rage moved forward. What happened next would be debated in Tarkhan military academies for a generation. Not because it was complicated, because it wasn't. Commander Yates's 4 fire teams hit Keth 7's maintenance ring at the 17-degree gap in the defensive grid, exactly as Torres had calculated. The breach took 11 seconds. Human boarding technology operating on principles the Tarkhan engineers, who later examined the entry point, would describe, baffled as aggressively pragmatic. The door wasn't hacked. It wasn't bypassed. It was simply no longer a door. The 2 security guards at the junction corridor on sublevel 3 saw 4 humans in black tactical armor moving toward them at a pace that suggested the concept of caution had been left on the shuttle. They had a brief, intense conversation about their career choices and surrendered without incident. This was, in hindsight, the correct decision. The detention block supervisor, a Tarkhan sergeant named Hevath, heard the alarms, looked at his security feed, and did something that would later earn him a commendation from his own government and an unofficial note of appreciation from the United Earth Navy. He unlocked every cell on sublevel 4 and stood in the corridor with his hands up. "I want it on record," he said to the first Marine through the door, "that I told the executor this was a bad idea." The Marine, a scarred veteran named Kowalski who had been doing this for 16 years, looked at him for a moment. "Noted," said Kowalski. "Where are they?" Hevath pointed. 11 people. Some bruised, some exhausted, all alive. Ensign Priya Mehta, 22 years old, first deep space posting, looked up as the fire team came through the door and made a sound that Kowalski would not describe to anyone afterward, because there are some things that belong only to the people in the room. Alexei Mehta, 24 years old, married 11 months, had a split lip and a healing bruise across his left cheekbone. He looked at the Marines in the doorway. He looked at the patch on Kowalski's shoulder. The patch of the Promethean rage, the ship's crest, the one they all wore. "The captain sent you," he said. It wasn't a question. "The captain sent us," Kowalski confirmed. Alexei closed his eyes for a second, nodded once, got to his feet. "Then let's go." Above, the Promethean rage was having a conversation with Keth 7's defensive systems. It was a short conversation. The station's 23 defensive cannons were functional, well-maintained, and crewed by trained Tarkhan soldiers. Under normal circumstances, against a conventional attacker, they would have presented a serious obstacle. The Promethean rage was not a conventional attacker. She moved through the defensive fire with the unhurried confidence of something that had calculated exactly how much damage it could absorb and found the number acceptable. Her point defense systems handled the incoming fire in real time, not suppressing it, not evading it, just dealing with it, the way you deal with rain by wearing a coat. She was not trying to destroy the station. This was important, and the Tarkhan gunners, professional soldiers who understood the difference between a ship trying to kill you and a ship making sure you stay too busy to threaten someone else, gradually understood what they were seeing. The Promethean rage wasn't fighting the station. She was occupying it, keeping every gun barrel pointed at her, keeping every sensor array focused on her, keeping the entire defensive apparatus of Keth-7 engaged and busy and unable to look at anything else. While 4 fire teams walked out of the detention block, through the maintenance corridors, back to the breach point, and onto their shuttle with 11 rescued crew members. The shuttle docked with the Promethean rage at 18 minutes and 44 seconds after Sarah had opened her first channel. 1 minute and 16 seconds before her deadline. Sarah watched the docking confirmation light go green on her board. She let out a breath she had been holding quietly, where no one could see it. "All personnel confirmed aboard?" she asked. "All personnel confirmed aboard," Torres said. "Medical team has them. Everyone's alive. Alexei Mehta has non-critical injuries. Everyone else is—" He paused, cleared his throat. "Everyone else is okay, Captain." Sarah nodded. She looked at Keith-7 on her display, at the defensive cannons that had been firing at her ship for the last 18 minutes and had accomplished approximately nothing except creating a light show. She thought about Executor Solve, somewhere on that station, watching his plan collapse in real time. She opened one final channel. "Executor, my crew is aboard. I'm withdrawing as promised." A pause. "You should know that I'm filing a full incident report with the Galactic Compact Oversight Council. Every communication log, every navigation record, every medical scan of my recovered personnel. The review that was going to take 4 to 7 months, I suspect it will move somewhat faster now, given that I'll also be including the sensor records of this station's detention levels." Another pause. Quieter. "The 11 people you held were surveyors, scientists, a corpsman and his wife on their first deployment. They had done nothing wrong. They were never a threat to you. Remember that. The next time your government looks at a human crew and tries to calculate how much it can get away with, remember that those people have names, and they have ships, and those ships have crews who know those names." She closed the channel. "Helm," she said, "take us home." The Tarkon Hegemony's official statement, released 40 hours later, described the incident as a miscommunication regarding border jurisdiction and announced the voluntary release of 11 Earth personnel following a productive dialogue. No one believed this. Everyone pretended to. This is occasionally how diplomacy works. High Executor Marin Solve was reassigned to an administrative post on a Hegemony interior station so far from the border that it didn't appear on most navigational charts. This was described as a promotion. No one believed this either. Veth Durak was quietly awarded the Hegemony's second highest military citation, the one given for exceptional judgment under extreme operational pressure. The citation's classified annex noted that his recommendation to comply with the Promethean Rage's demands had been overruled, and that the actual outcome of the incident was largely attributable to human restraint rather than Hegemony defense capability. He framed it anyway. It still meant something. The Galactic Compact Oversight Council's review of Hegemony border detention practices was completed in 11 days. 11 days, not 7 months. Several significant policy changes followed. On the Promethean Rage, 3 days out from Keth-7, Dr. Ayanna Park cleared the last of the recovered crew from medical and sent them back to their quarters with instructions to sleep, eat, and bother her again only if something was actively on fire. Priya Mehta sat on the edge of a medical bay cot for a while after her clearance, not quite ready to move. Alexei sat beside her, their shoulders touching, not talking. Chief Engineer Dara Okafor stopped by on her way back to the engine room. She hadn't officially been cleared for duty yet and did not care, to squeeze Priya's shoulder and say, "Come find me when you're ready to get back to work. I've got a plasma conduit with your name on it." Priya laughed. It was small and rough and surprised out of her. It was the best sound anyone on that ship had heard in 6 days. Captain Sarah Voss filed her incident report, filed her medical reports, filed her navigation logs, filed every piece of documentation required by regulation, and several pieces that weren't strictly required, but that she included anyway because she believed in being thorough. Then she went to her cabin, sat in the chair by the viewport and watched the stars for a while. She thought about the Galactic Compact, about the 4 to 7 month timeline, about the 11 people who would have spent those months in a detention block on Sub-Level 4 while bureaucracies exchanged formal correspondence. She thought about what the galaxy sometimes forgot about human beings, what it kept having to relearn, incident by incident, engagement by engagement, that humans were genuinely a reasonable people, patient, diplomatic, committed to process and procedure and the peaceful resolution of disputes, right up until they weren't. And when they weren't, when the clock ran out, when the channels went silent, when someone made the catastrophic miscalculation of confusing human restraint for human weakness, there was nothing in the known galaxy that moved quite like a human warship with an angry crew and a captain who knew exactly where her people were. The stars outside the viewport burned on, indifferent and eternal. The Promethean rage flew home. The colony ship Ardent Hope drifted through the Kepler expanse like a sleeping heartbeat, slow, warm, full of life. It was not a military vessel. It carried no cannons, no rail drivers, no shielded battle plating along its hull. What it carried was far more precious, far more fragile. 431 children, ages 3 to 16, the sons and daughters of the Meridian Colony Project. Children who had never seen Earth, who had grown up between the stars, who knew the smell of recycled air as intimately as any prairie wind. They were being transferred to Helix Station, a grand academic hub at the edge of Dominion space, where they would receive the finest education in 7 star systems. Their parents had wept at the departure dock. Proud weeping, hopeful weeping, that was 6 days ago. On the bridge of the Ardent Hope, Captain Mara Solis reviewed the navigation logs for the 14th time that morning. Something had been bothering her since they crossed into the Velcathari corridor, a stretch of space technically classified as neutral territory, though everyone in the shipping lanes knew the Velcath considered it theirs by birthright. She'd filed the appropriate transit permits. She'd paid the corridor tax, 3 times the standard rate, as required for human vessels. She'd even transmitted the ceremonial greeting sequence that Velcath diplomacy demanded. 7 pulses of amber light, followed by complete radio silence for 60 seconds. She had done everything right, which was why the 3 Velcath warships appearing on her radar at 0413 hours felt like a thunderclap on a clear day. "They're not responding to hails," her comms officer, Lieutenant Davin Marsh, said. His voice was careful, controlled. "I've tried all 7 registered Velcath diplomatic frequencies. Try the emergency band." "Tried it, Captain. Nothing." Mara stared at the tactical display. 3 Velcath Spineclaw-class destroyers, each one 3 times the mass of the Ardent Hope, had arranged themselves in a triangular formation directly across their flight path. It was a blockade posture. It was also, she knew from her years in deep space transit, a hunting posture. "Wake the children's supervisors," she said quietly. "Tell them to keep everyone calm and in their quarters. Do not—" She paused, steadying her voice. "Do not tell the children anything yet." The next 40 minutes unfolded like a nightmare in slow motion. The Velcath ship sent no warning, no ultimatum, no demand. They simply opened fire. Not at the hull, not at the engines. They fired with surgical, deliberate precision at the Ardent Hope's communications array first, shearing it clean off in a single blast that rocked the ship like a toy in a tide. Then the port thrusters, then the emergency beacon housing. One by one, every system that could call for help was targeted and destroyed with the kind of methodical patience that spoke not of battle rage, but of a plan long rehearsed. Mara had time to send one message. She screamed it into the emergency subspace burst, an old low-tech channel that didn't route through the primary array. It was slow, it was ugly. It would take hours to reach anyone, but it was all she had. "Ardent Hope to any vessel. We are under attack in the Velcathari corridor. Civilian ship, 431 children aboard. We are." The subspace transmitter went dark. What happened next aboard the Ardent Hope was recorded only by the ship's internal black box logs. Logs that would later be retrieved, reviewed, and entered into the permanent record of the Galactic Tribunal. Every sound, every scream, every desperate attempt by the crew to shield the children in the deepest compartments of the ship. It took the Velkath 47 minutes to finish. When their warships finally peeled away from the wreckage and vanished back into the dark, the Ardent Hope was no longer a ship. It was a cooling graveyard of bent metal and silence, tumbling slowly through the corridor like a broken toy discarded by a child too large for this galaxy. 431 children. None survived. Back on Helix Station, a supervisor named Councilwoman Preth Veldara of the Velkath delegation was drinking her morning tea when the news arrived. She read the preliminary report twice. Then she set down her cup very carefully, smoothed her robes, and sent a single-line encrypted message to the Velkath High Command. Confirmed. The package has been delivered. She did not know, none of them knew, what had just been awakened. Because the subspace burst, moving at its slow, grinding speed through the dark, had already reached its first receiver. It had reached Fleet Admiral Jonas Kale, and Jonas Kale had children of his own. Fleet Admiral Jonas Kale received the subspace burst at 0611 hours aboard the UHNS Sovereign Wrath, the flagship of humanity's 7th Deep Space Fleet, currently on routine patrol near the Belthian Reach. He read it standing up. His communications officer, a young ensign named Reyes, had printed it on a physical slip of paper, old protocol for emergency subspace bursts, and handed it to the Admiral without a word. Reyes had read it first. He'd had to. Standard security procedure. And his hands, the Admiral noticed, were shaking. Kale read it. He read it again. He set it face down on the console. For exactly 12 seconds, Fleet Admiral Jonas Kale, 32-year veteran of the United Human Navy, survivor of the Battle of Drengar's Mouth, man who had once held a collapsing bulkhead shut with his bare hands for 4 minutes while his crew evacuated, said absolutely nothing. Then he picked up the fleet-wide command channel. This is Admiral Kale. Full battle readiness. All ships. Right now. His second-in-command, Rear Admiral Una Park, was on the bridge in 90 seconds. She took one look at his face and didn't ask questions. She simply moved to her station and began issuing the orders that turned a fleet at rest into a fleet with a purpose. Kyle sent 3 messages before his ships even finished their readiness checks. The first went to Helix Station. Confirm status of Ardent Hope. All available data. Immediate priority. The second went to the United Human Embassy in Velkath Space. Do not issue any statements. Do not take any meetings. Stand by. The third went to Earth, to the Secretary General of the Human Collective, to the Joint Chiefs, to the full Security Council. It was 4 sentences long. The Velkath Dominion has attacked and destroyed the civilian colony vessel Ardent Hope in the Velkathari corridor. 431 human children are confirmed dead. No survivors. Awaiting your orders, but advise you give them quickly. The response from Earth took 11 minutes. When it came, it was not from the Secretary General. It was from President Alara Voss herself, the first human head of state to contact a field admiral directly since the Callisto crisis 30 years ago. Her message was 6 words. You have everything you need. Go. What followed in the next 18 hours was something that military historians would later describe with a single, haunting phrase. The quiet mobilization. There were no speeches on the news feeds, no dramatic press conferences, no grandstanding politicians standing before cameras with fire in their eyes. The human collective government went silent, deliberately, completely silent, and that silence was louder than any declaration of war. But the galaxy watched, and the galaxy saw what was moving. Every Velkath monitoring station in a 12-system radius began logging anomalies within the first 6 hours. Ship signatures, lots of them. Not the usual trickle of freighters and patrol vessels. These were warship signatures, the distinctive quantum fold distortion patterns of human military vessels jumping from their home systems in coordinated waves. The Velkath High Command received their first intelligence report at hour 7. Their chief military analyst, a 4-limbed strategist named Keth Voran, stared at the numbers for a long time before he spoke. That cannot be correct, he said. It is correct, High Commander. his aide replied. We have confirmed 67 human warships in transit toward our border. The count is still climbing. Keth Voran turned to the wall-sized star map behind him, where small red indicators were blinking into existence across the sector like stars being born. How many fleets does this represent? 3 confirmed fleets, High Commander, possibly 4. A pause. There are also reports of human vessels being recalled from the outer reaches in the Cygnus patrol line. They appear to be consolidating. For what purpose? Nobody answered, because nobody wanted to say what they were all thinking. On the wreckage recovery vessel, Tenacious, Lieutenant Commander Faye Oduya led the team that reached the Ardent Hope at hour 14. She had volunteered for the assignment. She had not told anyone that she had a niece who had been aboard. Her team worked in silence. Recovery operations always had a kind of grim professionalism to them. The work of finding the dead was not performed with grief, because grief would make your hands shake and your vision blur, and you could not afford either when you were working in the debris field of a shattered ship. Grief came later in the dark, alone. But when Lieutenant Commander Oduya entered what remained of the Ardent Hope's primary shelter compartment, the deepest, most protected section of the ship, the one the crew had clearly tried to use as a final refuge, she stopped. The walls were covered in drawings. Children's drawings. Crayon and marker on the bare metal panels clearly made in those final terrible minutes when the crew had been trying to keep the children calm, when the adults had been running out of words and had handed the children drawing tools instead. Sons with faces, stick figure families, rockets, stars. A repeated motif that appeared in at least a dozen drawings. A blue-green planet with a ring of light around it. Earth, drawn by children who had never seen it, who only knew it from pictures and stories, who had drawn it in their last minutes alive because it was the most beautiful thing they could imagine. Faye Oduya stood there for a full minute. Then she took out her personal recorder and documented every single drawing, meticulously, one by one. Those images were transmitted to Fleet Admiral Kale with a single attached note. So you don't forget what you're doing this for. Kyle had them printed and pinned to the wall of his command center. He did not take them down. At hour 18, the Velkath Dominion's ambassador to the Galactic Accord, a senior diplomat named Velsor Kwan, formally requested an emergency closed session with the Accord's Peacekeeping Council. He was told the session had already been scheduled, by the humans. He was also told, politely but with no room for ambiguity, that the human delegation would not be presenting grievances. They would be presenting evidence. The Galactic Accord's Grand Chamber had hosted 47 emergency sessions in its 200-year history. Wars, plagues, the extinction event at Morvel 4, the Syndicate collapse. Its curved walls of pale stone had absorbed every kind of catastrophe the galaxy could produce. It had never seen anything quite like this. Every seat was filled. Species that hadn't sent delegations to the Accord in decades had dispatched representatives overnight. The Velkath delegation sat in their designated arc of seats, all 11 of them, and if they had been capable of sweating, they would have been. Ambassador Velsor Kwan had prepared a defense. A careful, layered, legally intricate defense built on 3 pillars: the Ardent Hope's alleged failure to properly file corridor transit papers, a disputed interpretation of the Velkathari Sovereignty Agreement, and a suggestion, carefully worded, never quite stated outright, that the humans had been running some kind of intelligence operation using the children's vessel as cover. He never got to deliver it, because when the human delegation entered the chamber, they were led not by a diplomat. They were led by Fleet Admiral Jonas Kyle. He wore his dress uniform, every medal, every decoration. 32 years of service arranged across his chest in neat rows. He walked to the human delegation's podium and placed his hands on it and looked out at the chamber. And the chamber went quiet the way rooms go quiet when something large and patient has entered them. He did not begin with legal arguments. He pressed a button. The chamber's central holographic display, a massive sphere of light designed to show star maps and tactical displays, filled instead with a single image: the crayon drawings from the shelter compartment of the Ardent Hope. He had arranged them in a grid, all of them. Every Earth with its ring of light, every smiling sun, every stick figure family, every rocket ship with a child's name written on the side in a child's careful, imperfect handwriting. He let the chamber look at them for 60 seconds. Then he spoke. Their names, he said, were on the manifest. He touched the podium again and the drawings were replaced by a list, a long scrolling list of names, ages, and home colonies. I'm going to read them. The Velkath ambassador began to rise. Admiral, this is highly irregular. The Accord's proceedings require— Sit down, said 12 different species representatives, simultaneously. Velsor Kwan sat down. Jonas Kale began to read. It took 19 minutes. 431 names, ages, where they were born, what they liked, because Kale's team had contacted every family, and the families had sent him things. A note that said Liam loved drawing starships and wanted to be an engineer. A note that said Priya was afraid of the dark and always slept with her light on. A note that said Tomas was 6 years old, and his favorite word was why, and he asked it about everything, all the time, every single day. By the time Admiral Kale reached the 215th name, 3 non-human delegates were visibly distressed. By the 350th, the chamber was the quietest it had ever been in 200 years. At 431 he stopped. He looked up from the list. I have documentation, he said in the same quiet, steady voice, that proves the Velkath High Command ordered this attack. I have the encrypted message sent by Councilwoman Preth Veldara confirming the attack was deliberate, planned, and sanctioned at the highest levels of the Velkath government. He paused. I also have 73 warships positioned at the boundary of Velkath space. The chamber erupted. Multiple delegations speaking at once. The Accord's chief arbiter hammering for order. The Velkath ambassador on his feet, shouting denials. But they were the wrong kind of denials. Too fast and too loud. The denials of a man who already knows the evidence exists and is hoping volume will serve where logic cannot. It took 4 minutes for the chamber to settle. When it did, it was because a delegation that almost never spoke had asked for the floor. The Mirathi Collective, the oldest spacefaring civilization in the Accord, a species so ancient that 3 of the galaxy's current starfaring cultures were descended from their early colonies, had not issued a formal statement in 60 years. Their representative, an elder called Sev Amarant, moved to the central speaking position with the slow, deliberate care of extreme age. When Sev Amarant spoke, every other voice in the galaxy, it sometimes seemed, stopped to listen. We have reviewed the Admiral's evidence, the elder said. The Mirathi's translator rendered their voice as something low and resonant, like sound traveling through deep water. It is complete. It is unambiguous. The Velkath Dominion ordered the deliberate murder of 431 non-combatant human children in neutral space. A pause of exactly 3 seconds. The Mirathi Collective formally recognizes humanity's right of full military response. The silence that followed was the kind that changes things. It was the silence of a door closing that will not open again. In the Velkath Dominion's capital, the High Command had been watching the Accord session on secure feed. When Sev Amarant finished speaking, High Commander Keth Varan turned away from the display and looked at his senior staff. How many human ships are now confirmed at our border? He asked. His intelligence chief answered without looking up from his console. The answer was the same as the last answer, but larger now. Much larger. 91 warships, High Commander. 3 full carrier groups. Admiral Kale has also been joined by vessels from 6 allied human colony systems. A pause. And the Brithani Trade Federation has recalled its own ships from Velkath space. The Brithani? Keth Varan's voice was very quiet. Yes, sir. They cited moral objection to continued presence in Velkath territory. Similar notices have been filed by the Tesseri Cooperative and the Lundara Compact. Keth Varan understood what that meant. It wasn't just warships gathering at his border. It was the galaxy turning its back. One by one, the trade routes closing, the diplomatic channels going cold, the slowly, methodically, inexorably tightening isolation of a civilization that had made a catastrophic mistake and was only now beginning to understand the true dimensions of what it had done. He had thought humans were like every other species, capable of being pushed, of being provoked, of having lines crossed, and then, eventually, of being managed back down. Every species could be negotiated with, delayed, redirected. Patience and politics, in Keth Varan's long experience, could outlast almost any anger. He was learning something now that he should have known before he ordered those warships into the corridor. Human grief was not a fire that burned and faded. It was a forge. The formal ultimatum was delivered at hour 71. Not by a diplomat, not through the Accord's channels. It was transmitted directly to the Velkath High Command, on a military frequency by Fleet Admiral Jonas Kale, from the bridge of the UHNS Sovereign Wrath, which was now positioned 14,000 kilometers from the Velkath Dominion's primary border station. It was 11 sentences long. It demanded the immediate surrender of every individual in the chain of command that had ordered and executed the attack on the Ardent Hope. It demanded full reparations to the families of every child killed. It demanded the permanent dissolution of the Velkathari Corridor sovereignty claim, and its cession to the Galactic Accord as neutral administered territory. It demanded a formal public apology broadcast on every Velkath communications channel for no fewer than 30 consecutive days, and it gave the Velkath High Command 1 hour to comply. Or what? High Commander Keth Varan had reportedly asked when the message finished playing. His intelligence chief had pulled up the latest sensor data and put it on screen without a word. 91 warships, 3 carrier groups, alongside them now, and this was the part that had begun keeping the entire High Command awake at night, a growing convoy of civilian vessels, not military, not combat ships, transports, habitat modules, construction barges. The kind of fleet you built not to fight over a territory but to move into it. The humans weren't just coming to destroy. They were coming to stay. And that, somehow in a way that military might alone could never have communicated, was the thing that finally broke the High Command's certainty. You could rebuild from a defeat. You could regroup, rearm, reclaim. History was full of defeated empires that had risen again, but you could not reclaim land that was already occupied, already settled, already lived in by a species that had 431 reasons to make absolutely certain it would never, ever be moved. The emergency session of the Velkath High Command lasted 6 minutes. The formal request for negotiated surrender was transmitted at hour 71 minutes and 58 seconds. It arrived with 2 seconds to spare. Councilwoman Preth Veldara was arrested by Accord peacekeeping officers 4 hours later, along with 14 members of the Velkath military command structure. The evidence Admiral Kale had presented left no room for interpretation, and the Accord, for the first time in its history, voted unanimously to authorize extradition. The vote was 219-0. The Velkath delegation abstained. It was the closest thing to a confession the chamber had ever seen. Feoduya was not on the Sovereign Wrath when the surrender came through. She was still on the Tenacious, finishing the recovery operation on the Ardent Hope. There was still work to do, careful, quiet, necessary work. She was still in the shelter compartment when her comms unit buzzed with the news. She read it. She sat with it for a moment. Then she looked up at the wall of drawings around her, the blue-green earth with its rings of light drawn over and over again by 431 children, who had never seen it, who had only ever known the space between stars. She thought about what it meant that those drawings existed, that in the last minutes, surrounded by darkness and fear, and the sounds of their world ending, children had reached for crayons and drawn the most beautiful thing they knew. She thought that maybe that was the most human thing of all. Not the warships, not the ultimatum, not the 91-ship fleet that had made an empire flinch. The drawing, the refusal to stop imagining something beautiful. She pressed her fingertips lightly to the wall, not touching the drawings, just near them, the way you stand near something precious without presuming to hold it. "We came back for you," she said quietly. "All of you. We came back." The Ardent Hope's black box recorder was recovered, and its contents entered into the permanent historical record of the Galactic Accord. The children's drawings were digitally preserved and transmitted to every species in the Accord, a gesture that Kale had authorized personally, over the objections of several of his own staff who felt it was manipulative. "Good," he'd said. Let them be moved. The Vel-Cathari corridor was ceded to Accord administration within 90 days. A permanent memorial beacon was placed at the coordinates where the Ardent Hope had been destroyed, a simple light, white and steady, visible on long-range sensors for 11 light-years in every direction. Its official designation in the Accord's navigation registry was clinical, bureaucratic, and easy to miss if you weren't looking. But every human pilot in the deep lanes knew what it meant. They had a different name for it. They called it the Children's Lamp. And for a generation of Vel-Cath navigators, it became the single most carefully avoided set of coordinates in their star charts, not because of any law or treaty, but because of something simpler and older and far more durable than either. Because when you pass a light that marks the place where 431 children drew pictures of Earth in their final minutes, you feel it. Whatever you are, whatever you have done, however many light years of cold space separate you from the concept of conscience, you feel it. And you go around. The Conclave of Seven voted on humanity's fate on a Tuesday. They didn't consider it a significant occasion. No ceremony. No declaration broadcast across stars. 7 elder races sitting around a table carved from the bones of a dead moon, passing a data slate from hand to tendril to manipulator claw, each pressing their biometric seal without bothering to read the full document. The youngest delegate, a Vraxi ambassador barely 4 centuries old, didn't even look up from the secondary report she was reviewing when she pressed her mark. The resolution passed 7-0. Humanity would be permitted to exist. 1 planet, 1 solar system, hard boundary perimeter installed at the heliopause, a shimmering wall of conclave-grade gravitational distortion that no human vessel could penetrate without instantly liquefying everyone aboard. No expansion, no colonization, no contact with other species without prior approval submitted in triplicate, reviewed over a standard conclave processing period of 30 to 40 years. The word they used in the official document was reservation. The word they used in their private communique was mercy. They had debated extermination. The record shows it was a genuine debate, not rhetorical, not a formality. The Drath had argued for it with calm, methodical logic. Humanity had existed for less than 300,000 years and had already split the atom, cracked genetic code, developed rudimentary faster-than-light theory, and launched 2 unprovoked wars between their own nations that had killed hundreds of millions of their own kind. The Drath ran projections, gave humanity another 500 years of unimpeded development, and the probability of a Kardashev crossing was 94.7%. Give them 1,000 years and the probability of interspecies conflict initiation rose to 99.2%. The math was not subtle. They are, the Drath senior delegate had said, a fire that does not know it is a fire. The counter-argument made by the ancient Ulari, who were themselves 7 billion years old and had seen 43 civilizations rise and fall, was simpler. Wait and see. The cage costs nothing. The burning costs everything. So they built the cage. They called it mercy. On Earth, on a cold Wednesday morning in Geneva, the notification arrived not as a diplomatic communique but as a direct signal override. Every screen, every radio, every networked device on the planet simultaneously displaying a single translated message in every human language simultaneously. Your species has been evaluated. You are confined to your home system pending reassessment. Boundary enforcement is automatic and lethal. Compliance is not optional. This message constitutes full notification under Conclave Resolution 7 Omicron 4. No further communication is required or expected. The message lasted 11 seconds. Then every screen returned to whatever it had been showing before. A football match in Brazil resumed mid-play. A child's cartoon in South Korea continued exactly where it left off. 3 billion people sat in silence for a long moment, then the phone calls started. Commander Yeva Strelnikova was standing on the observation deck of the ISS when the message appeared on her tablet. She read it once, read it again, looked out the viewport at the blue curve of Earth below, the Sahara, a burnt sienna smear, the Atlantic glittering cold silver, a hurricane unfurling its slow white arms over the Caribbean. She thought about the word reservation. She had grown up in Siberia. Her grandmother had grown up in a small village that had been for decades essentially a reservation of a different kind, a people told where they could go, what they could do, who they were allowed to become. Her grandmother had told her stories, not bitter stories, quiet ones, survival stories, stories about what people did when someone drew a line around them and said, "This is your world now. Don't go beyond it." Her grandmother's people had gone beyond it. Every single time. Yeva set the tablet face down on the console. She pulled up the propulsion schematics for the experimental ion drive currently being tested in Cargo Bay 4. Thought for a moment, then opened a secure channel to Earth. "This is Commander Strelnikova," she said. "I need to speak with the Director of Advanced Propulsion. Tell him it's about efficiency upgrades." She paused. "Tell him we have a lot of work to do." Below, on Earth, the reactions split along the fault lines that had always defined humanity. 37 governments issued formal protests to an address that did not respond. The protests were eloquent. They cited international law, human rights frameworks, philosophical arguments about sovereignty and self-determination. They were transmitted into silence. 12 governments immediately began classified weapons programs aimed at breaking the boundary. Most were underfunded. Several were duplicates of each other. One, in a small country that had always punched above its weight in aerospace engineering, was already 6 years ahead of anything else on the planet. Because its director had been quietly working on the problem since the boundary appeared, not because she knew it was coming, but because she was the sort of person who, upon hearing a door had been locked, immediately began studying the mechanism of locks. Her name was Dr. Amara Ose. She was 43 years old. She had not slept more than 5 hours in any single night since the message appeared. She was not angry. She was focused. Across the planet, in universities and garages and converted warehouses and government black sites and the spare bedrooms of people who had quit their jobs to work on the problem full-time, the same thing was happening. The same orientation. The same pivot. Humanity had been given a cage, so humanity started studying the cage. The boundary, the heliopause perimeter, became the most examined thing in human history within 6 months. More scientific papers were published on it than on any other subject in any other year. Every nation, every institution, every private research body aimed everything it had at the shimmering distortion field at the edge of the solar system. Probes were sent. Probes were destroyed. Data was collected from the destruction. More probes were sent. The conclave observing this noted it with a kind of distant academic interest. "They are studying the cage," the Drath reported. The Ulari, older than human civilization by a factor of 23,000, made a sound that, translated through 17 layers of interpretation software, came out closest to, "Of course they are." The first sign that something was changing, the first thing that should have perhaps alarmed the conclave, came 18 months after the reservation was established. It was not a weapon. It was not an attempt to breach the boundary. It was a message, transmitted not toward the boundary, not toward any conclave station, but outward, in all directions, using a communications array that humanity had quietly upgraded to an output power that should not have been theoretically possible, with the technology they were supposed to have. The message was not a protest, not a plea, not a demand. It was a mathematical proof. A proof so elegant that when the Ulari senior delegate reviewed it, she sat still for a very long time before speaking. The proof demonstrated a fundamental flaw in the gravitational distortion equation the conclave had used to construct the boundary. Not a large flaw, not one that would allow a ship to pass through, but a flaw nonetheless. A theoretical gap that, if exploited correctly over sufficient time, might, possibly eventually. "How long?" the Ulari asked. The analysis team ran the numbers. "Given their current rate of technological development?" The analyst paused. 40 years. Perhaps 50. The Ulari was quiet for a long moment. "And their current rate of technological development," she said slowly, "has accelerated how much since the reservation was established?" The analyst checked the figures. did not speak for several seconds. 312%, the analyst said quietly. The Ulari stood up from her chair, walked to the viewport, looked out at the stars. Billions of them, ancient and silent, witnesses to 43 civilizations, and their rises and their falls. Reconvene the conclave, she said. Is there a concern to report? The Ulari made that sound again. This time the translation software rendered it differently. Awe, it said. Awe, with a strong secondary note of fear. Year 7 of the reservation. The thing the conclave had not modeled, the thing that sat outside every projection and probability matrix they ran, was what humanity would do when it stopped fighting itself. Not entirely. There were still conflicts, still borders, still disputes, still elections that turned ugly and old grievances that flared. The conclave monitors recorded all of it faithfully and incorporated it into their models. The models said, this species will continue to fragment. Internal division will slow their development. This is the expected pattern. The models were wrong, because something had changed in the geometry of human politics. Something invisible, unlegislated, unannounced. A shift in the collective center of gravity that happened not because a leader declared it or a treaty mandated it, but because 7 billion people had looked up at the same message on the same screens at the same moment and felt the same thing simultaneously. They were not alone in the universe, and the universe did not like them. It is difficult to overstate what this did to the human psyche. Every religion, every philosophy, every cultural tradition had speculated about the question of other life in the cosmos. The answer had always been theoretical, abstract, a matter for late nights and telescope time and argument. Now it was real. Now it had a face. 7 faces, in fact, and none of them had thought humanity worth more than 11 seconds of attention before going back to their other business. The anger lasted about 2 years. Pure, white-hot, species-wide fury. Protests at every conclave monitoring station. Manifestos. A movement that called itself Children of the Cage, that briefly became one of the most politically powerful forces on Earth before burning itself out on its own intensity. Then the anger became something else. Purpose. In year 3, the Global Infrastructure Compact was signed, not by governments in a ceremonial hall, but by 700 corporations, 12,000 municipalities, and 3 billion individual citizens in a digital referendum that ran for 11 days. It was not a government. It was something harder to define and more powerful than government. A shared commitment to resource allocation and project prioritization that had no precedent in human history. In year 4, fusion power went from a decade away to operational. It had been a decade away for 6 decades. The funding had tripled. The talent had concentrated. The collaborative barriers between national research programs had dissolved. When the first sustained fusion reaction exceeded break-even at the Atacama facility, the lead engineer, a 29-year-old woman named Priya Nair, who had defended her doctorate 11 months earlier, did not make a speech. She pulled up her workstation, entered a new set of parameters, and kept working. In year 5, the vertical farms covered 40% of the Sahara. Not because someone had decided to end hunger as an idealistic project, but because a species locked in a single solar system and facing unlimited time could not afford to waste a kilogram of arable resource. The engineering was staggering. Water reclamation systems, soil synthesis, atmospheric humidity networks. 20 years earlier, it would have been impossible. Now it was simply the obvious next thing to do. In year 6, the asteroid mining consortium pulled its first commercially viable platinum haul from a rock in the inner belt. The conclave monitoring satellite recorded this event and transmitted it to conclave headquarters. The analyst flagged it with a simple note. They are consuming their own solar system's resources. Contained. Expected. What the analyst did not flag was the secondary data. The rate of extraction was already 3 times higher than projections, and the humans were not spending the extracted resources on comfort or competition. They were spending them on infrastructure, specifically, on ships. Year 9 of the reservation. Dr. Amara Osei stood before an assembly of 412 of the planet's most gifted physicists, engineers, and mathematicians. The room was in a mountain in the Swiss Alps, 3 kilometers underground, in a facility that officially did not exist and had consumed more materials than the original ISS program. On the display behind her was a schematic. "The boundary," she said, "is not a wall." She let that sit for a moment. The conclave built it to function like a wall, but it is not a wall. It is a standing wave. A resonance pattern in spacetime maintained by a network of 17 automated anchors positioned at the heliopause. She advanced the slide. Walls you can try to break, resonance patterns you tune. Silence in the room. If we can introduce a counter-resonance, a specific frequency of gravitational distortion at the correct amplitude and phase, we do not break the boundary. We create a window in it. Small, temporary, but real. A hand went up from the third row. Dr. James Okafor, Oxford Theoretical Physics, one of the 11 people who had independently derived portions of the original mathematical proof that had so alarmed the conclave. "The energy requirements," he said, "are solved," Amara said. Okafor blinked. The fusion array at Atacama, operating in tandem with the secondary arrays at Baikonur and Vandenberg, running at 112% capacity in synchronized burst mode, can produce the required gravitational pulse for... She checked her notes, though she had long since memorized the figure. 9.3 seconds. 9 seconds, someone said from the back. 9.3, Amara corrected. And a ship? She advanced the slide again. The ship on the display was nothing like any human vessel that had ever flown. It was built entirely around the assumption of 9.3 seconds. It was optimized for one thing, getting through a window in space-time that would exist for less than 10 seconds. It had no cargo capacity, minimal life support, and a crew of 1. It had the most powerful conventional drive ever assembled, positioned to fire the instant the window opened, optimized for the first 3 seconds of acceleration, which would be the only seconds that mattered. One pilot, Amara said. On the other side of the boundary in interstellar space for the first time in human history. To do what? Someone asked. To prove we can, she said. That's enough. For now, that's enough. Year 11 of the reservation. Commander Yeva Strelnikova had not been the only applicant for the mission. There had been 412. The selection committee had interviewed all of them. The final list of 5 had been reviewed by 7 independent panels. The decision had been unanimous. It was always going to be Yeva. She was 51 years old. She had spent more time in space than any human being alive, having logged over 1,000 days across 6 long-duration missions. She was the calmest person in any room she entered. Not a coldness, not a distance, but a quality of absolute present-moment attention that the psychologists who interviewed her described in their notes with a word that surprised even them. Equanimity. She also had an instinct for improvisation that the simulation records had captured 16 times across the training program. Moments where the parameters changed, where the plan dissolved, and she made a decision in the gap between 1 second and the next that was not the decision anyone had pre-planned, but was exactly the right decision anyway. The mission was called Project Threshold. Officially. Internally, the team called it something else. They called it the starting point. On the morning of the launch, Yeva ate breakfast alone in the crew module, looking out the port at the Earth. She did not feel heroic. She did not feel afraid. She felt the same thing she had felt standing at the viewport of the ISS 11 years ago, reading the reservation notice on her tablet. Of course, what else would we do? The launch was not broadcast. The conclave monitoring satellites orbited at the heliopause. They would detect the window, detect the ship, detect everything. There was no hiding it. But the humans had made the deliberate choice not to announce it ahead of time. Not because they feared the conclave could stop them. The window would exist for 9.3 seconds, and any conclave response time was orders of magnitude slower than that. But because it was not yet a moment for speeches, it was a moment for doing. The pulse fired at 0400 hours. synchronized across 3 continents. The window opened. Yeva's ship hit it at exactly the right angle at exactly the right velocity. 9.3 seconds later, for the first time in human history, a human being was in interstellar space. She had 4 minutes of life support. She used 3 of them to run every sensor she had, recording everything. Composition of the interstellar medium, exact gravitational parameters of the boundary as seen from the outside, the positions of the 17 conclave anchor stations, the precise resonance signature of the boundary field from the exterior. With 1 minute left, she turned the ship around. She had just enough delta V to re-enter through the window before it fully closed. She made it with 11 seconds to spare. When the recovery team pulled her from the capsule, she was already looking at the data on a handheld screen. "Well?" the recovery chief asked. Yeva did not look up. "The anchors," she said. "They're not hardened." A pause. "They thought they wouldn't need to be," she continued. "They thought no one would ever get out far enough to touch them." She finally looked up. Her expression was not triumphant. It was something more dangerous than triumph. 14 months, she said. "Build me a ship that can reach the nearest anchor. 14 months. The conclave received the report from their heliopause monitoring system at 600 hours, and the data was so far outside predicted parameters that the automated system flagged it as a sensor malfunction. A human vessel, one human vessel, single occupant, no weapons, no communication array, had breached the boundary, remained in interstellar space for less than 4 minutes, and re-entered. The conclave analyst reviewed the report, re-reviewed it, called a second analyst. The second analyst called a third. Within 2 hours, the report was sitting before the full conclave monitoring committee, and the committee was experiencing something that none of them, collectively representing over 40,000 years of institutional experience, had expected to feel about humanity. Uncertainty. "The window," the chief analyst said. "They found the window, the resonance flaw in the boundary field. We identified that flaw as theoretically exploitable," another analyst said. "The projection was 40 years, minimum. It has been 11 years. Silence. "The acceleration rate," someone said. "The 300% figure from 4 years ago. What is it now?" The numbers came up. The acceleration had not plateaued. It had not stabilized. It had continued to compound, following a curve that looked, to anyone who had studied civilizational development across multiple species, like nothing so much as a near vertical ascent. "They have not been slowing down," the chief analyst said. "They have been accelerating. They have been using the confinement as—" She stopped. "As fuel," the Ulari delegate said. She had been silent through the entire briefing. She was looking at the display showing the trajectory the human vessel had taken, the precise, efficient, perfect arc from launch to window to re-entry. "They are using the confinement as fuel." The room was very quiet. "Convene the full conclave," she said. "Now. Not in 30 days. Not in the standard session. Now." "On what grounds?" The Ulari looked at her for a long moment. "On the grounds," she said, "that we made an error." The full conclave convened in 14 hours, unprecedented speed for a body that normally moved on a scale of decades. All 7 delegates present. The Drath, who had argued for extermination 12 years ago, arrived first and sat very still with the particular stillness of a being who has run a probability model and does not like the results. The briefing was comprehensive. 47 minutes of data, projections, and analysis. When it was done, the chamber was quiet for a long time. "They will reach an anchor station," the Drath said. "Not in 40 years. The revised projection? 14 months to a prototype vessel capable of the journey," the analyst said, "if they choose to build one." "They have already begun," a second analyst said. "We detected construction initialization at 3 separate orbital facilities 6 days ago." "Before the breach," someone noted. "Yes, before the breach. They were already working on the next step before they completed the current one." The Drath made a sound that its species made when confronted with data that overturned a confident prior conclusion. It was not a pleasant sound. If they reach an anchor station, the Drath said, and if they can compromise it, the boundary fails, the chief analyst confirmed. Not immediately, not completely, but the resonance degrades. Given their demonstrated capability to exploit resonance flaws, they would have the boundary down in a pause. Months. Months. Possibly weeks. More silence. Options, the Ulari said. The Drath spoke first, as they always did when the topic was action. Harden the anchors, upgrade the boundary, make it impenetrable. Timeline for implementation? 2 years minimum. They will reach the anchor in 14 months. The Drath said nothing. Destroy the prototype vessels, another delegate suggested. How? Someone asked. We have no assets inside the boundary capable of precision action without killing millions. The automated boundary systems are exterior-facing. We did not design for intervention inside the perimeter, because we never thought intervention inside the perimeter would be necessary, someone else said, with a tone that, even through translation, carried the specific flavor of this was a mistake, and we all know it. Engagement, the Ulari said. The word fell into the room like a stone. Everyone looked at her. We speak to them, she said. Directly, not an 11-second notification. A conversation. The Drath's posture shifted, the alien equivalent of skepticism. To what end? To understand what they actually want, the Ulari said. Because I notice we have never asked. The message came to Earth on a Wednesday again. Not an override. Not a broadcast to every screen simultaneously. A single tight beam signal directed at the Global Infrastructure Compact's primary communications array, addressed specifically to Dr. Amara Osi and Commander Yeva Strelnikova, by name. The message was 400 words. It was, by Conclave standards, extraordinarily direct. It acknowledged that humanity had breached the boundary. It acknowledged that humanity had identified the anchor system. It did not threaten. It did not warn. It asked a question. What do you want? Amara read the message, read it again, forwarded it to Yeva on the orbital platform where the prototype vessel was already 40% assembled. Yeva's response came back in 6 minutes, 4 words. We want to leave. Amara smiled at her screen. She had expected those 4 words. She had already written her own response. Longer, more diplomatic, structured in the careful language of a document that would outlast her. She sent Yeva's response first, as she had planned. Then she sent her own. It was 43 pages. It covered everything. Not aggression, not demands for rights or restitution or an apology, though those things would come in time, in their own conversations. It covered humanity's nature, the full, honest, unvarnished account of what humanity was, violent and kind, brilliant and stupid, capable of breathtaking cruelty and breathtaking beauty, young in a way that was not a flaw but a condition, a species that had been trying to grow up for 300,000 years in a universe with no parents, no instruction manual, and no second chances. It covered what humanity had done with 11 years. The fusion arrays, the asteroid mines, the vertical farms, the spacecraft, the mathematical proofs, the acceleration. It covered the truth, which was this. Humanity had not been trying to break the cage out of spite or aggression, or the reckless ambition the Conclave had always feared. Humanity had been trying to break the cage because a species that has touched fire and glimpsed the dark and survived and grown and built and dreamed does not know how to stop. It wasn't ambition. It was nature. You gave us a reservation, Amara wrote in the final section, and called it mercy. We called it a starting point. Not because we disrespected the mercy, though we reject the premise, but because that is how we are built. Every wall we have ever encountered we have studied. Every lock we have ever found we have opened. Every horizon we have ever reached we have stood on and looked past. You are afraid of what we might become. We understand. We have been afraid of ourselves for most of our history. But we are asking you to consider that the thing you are afraid of, the fire, is also the thing that will one day stand beside you against whatever darkness comes next. We do not want your galaxy. We want a place in it. We are asking you to consider that these two things are not the same. The conclave deliberated for 9 days. By conclave standards, this was instantaneous. The Ulari delegate later said, in a memoir that would be translated into every language in the known galaxy, that she had never seen the 7 elder races move so fast on anything, that the 9 days were, in their way, as startling as everything else humanity had done. The deliberation was not clean. The Drath position, hardened boundary, increased monitoring, no engagement, had real support. 3 of the 7 delegates had genuine fear responses to the 43-page document, not because it threatened them, but because it clarified the situation in a way that could not be undone. Once you understood what humanity was, truly understood it, in the way that Amara's document forced you to understand it, the comfortable fiction of the reservation as a permanent solution dissolved. There was no permanent solution. There was only what came next. 2 delegates proposed a middle path, a monitored expansion, specific star systems pre-approved. Humanity on a leash, essentially, but a longer one. A leash with a timeline attached. Perform, demonstrate stability, earn the next sector. The Ulari rejected this. Not the idea itself. The frame. We are not their parents, she said on the 5th day of deliberation. We decided to act as their jailers and we were wrong. We cannot now decide to act as their teachers and be right. These are both the same error, the same presumption. She paused. They are not a young species asking for our guidance. They are a peer who arrived late to a party we had been at for 7 billion years. We owe them a seat. Not a corner to sit in. A seat. The risk is real, she said. I do not dismiss it. They are dangerous. They may always be dangerous. But so is every species at every conclave table. She looked at each of them in turn. The Drath collapsed 3 neighboring civilizations in their 3rd century of expansion. We do not speak of it because it was long ago and because the Drath are our allies now. The question has never been whether a species is capable of harm. The question is whether they are capable of more than harm. And I have read their document. She let the weight of that settle. I have read their document and I am telling you, they are capable of considerably more than harm. The vote on day 9. 4-3. Humanity would be offered first contact terms. Not a release from the reservation. The boundary would remain for now, not as a cage but as a formality. A bureaucratic artifact to be dissolved through a negotiation process that both sides agreed to. What was being offered was the beginning of a conversation. An official, peer-level, first contact dialogue. The 3 dissenting delegates and the Drath among them signed the resolution anyway, because that was the conclave's law, and because even the Drath, running their probability models with the new data, could not find a realistic path in which keeping humanity caged produced a better outcome than this. The math, after all, had never been subtle. The formal first contact delegation arrived at Earth's L2 point on a Thursday, 14 months and 6 days after Yeva's breach flight. 3 ships. Conclave diplomatic configuration. Running full illumination on their drives so that every telescope on Earth and in orbit could see them clearly, unambiguously, from the moment they dropped out of their transit gate 4 million kilometers out. They had transmitted their arrival announcement 48 hours in advance. Not an 11-second override on every screen. A proper diplomatic communique, addressed to the Global Infrastructure Compact, referencing Amara's 43-page document by title and date. Every major city on Earth had people in the streets. Not protesters, not soldiers, just people. Standing outside, looking up at a sky that looked the same as it always had, but felt entirely different. Billions of ordinary humans, standing in streets and parks and on rooftops and in fields, looking up at the same sky at the same time, carrying within them the specific, irreplaceable human feeling of a moment that nothing would come after the same way. In Geneva, in the GIC's main hall, a delegation of 40 humans stood at the far end of a table that had been set up for this specific meeting. Amara was there. Yeva was there, having come down from orbit for the first time in 8 months. Still carrying the particular stillness of someone who had been in space and come back changed in a way that doesn't fully translate into words. There were diplomats there, and scientists, and 2 artists, and a 14-year-old girl named Saya, who had won a global competition with an essay about what she would say to an alien civilization if she had only 1 minute, and who had been included because Yeva had personally read the essay and insisted. The conclave delegation entered. 7 beings who did not look like anything the artist had imagined and yet were unmistakably, recognizably present. Minds behind the forms, intention behind the motion, the particular quality of intelligent awareness that humanity had speculated about for centuries and was now experiencing directly. The Ulari delegate moved to the head of the table. She was ancient in a way that bent light around her somehow, as if time had bent to accommodate her. She looked at the human delegation for a long moment. She spoke. The translation came through the earpieces that had been distributed with careful advance work. "We made an error," she said. "We treated your confinement as a judgment. It was not. It was a fear. We are old enough to know the difference, and we failed to act on that knowledge." She paused. "This conversation is not a gift we are offering you. It is a correction we are making to ourselves." Amara stepped forward. She had prepared a speech. Long, careful, structured in the diplomatic idiom of a document meant to set the tone of everything that came after. She did not give that speech. She looked at the Ulari, this being 7 billion years old, this mind that had watched 43 civilizations rise and fall, this creature of absolute ancient patience who had cast the deciding vote, and said what was actually true. "We have been waiting for this moment since we first looked up at the sky and wondered if anyone was looking back," she said. "We have been waiting so long that we built it ourselves, because that is what we do when we have to wait." The Ulari made a sound. The translation software, for the first time since it had been calibrated, produced 3 words, and then stopped, because the third word was not a word, but a concept that required 17 layers of context to render, and it had decided that the single most accurate approximation was to produce the first 2 words, and then fall silent in the specific way that silence sounds when it contains more meaning than language can hold. The first 2 words were, "Yes. Finally." 6 months later, the boundary came down, not in one dramatic moment, not a flash or an explosion or a ceremony. It degraded over 47 days as the anchor stations were decommissioned one by one, their resonance patterns dissolving into the interstellar medium. The last patch of boundary shimmer, over the south pole of the heliopause, a faint aurora-like remnant that ground-based observatories could just barely detect, faded on a Tuesday morning, at approximately the same hour of the day that the conclave had voted on humanity's fate 12 years before. No one on Earth knew this. It was not announced. The monitoring data was processed by automated systems and filed in a database and sat there, unread, for 3 days before anyone thought to look. When they did look, the researcher who found the file, a 26-year-old graduate student at the University of Cape Town named De La Mensa, who was running a comparison of boundary resonance data as part of a dissertation on gravitational wave physics, sat for a moment in front of his screen. He called his mother. "Mom," he said, "I have to tell you something." He told her. She cried a little. He did too, though he would not admit this to anyone except eventually his own children. Then he closed the call, turned back to his screen and kept working. Because the data was there, and there was still so much to understand, and the universe was larger than it had been 12 years ago. Not in fact, but in permission, which is a different and in some ways more important thing. And humanity had always been most fully itself in the space between one horizon cleared and the next one barely visible. Years later, at a conference on multi-species relations held in the orbital habitat above Titan, a habitat built by human engineers and Ulari architects and Vraxi material specialists, which was already a poem in structural form if you knew what you were looking at, a young conclave diplomat asked the Ulari delegate a question that had been circling in academic circles since the first contact. "If you could go back," the diplomat asked. Would you still build the reservation? The Ulari was quiet for a long moment. No, she said. Because it was wrong. Because it was unnecessary, she said. The cage did not make them what they became. They were already what they became. The cage only accelerated it. She looked out the viewport at Saturn, enormous and ringed and indifferent. They did not become extraordinary because we confined them, she said. They became extraordinary because they are human. The confinement was irrelevant to that. They would have arrived here at this table at this moment eventually, with or without it. A pause. The only thing the cage did was ensure they arrived faster. She made that sound again, the one the translation software had been wrestling with for 12 years and had never fully resolved. This time it translated as, we should have known. They always come through.